In 2015, a SWAT team fired 30 rounds at a Navy vet and their partner, who was a person of interest in an alleged crime. Needless to say, the couple died, but their 4-month-old son, who was in the back seat, somehow survived. The vet was a casualty of police violence. Her name is India Kager, and you probably haven't heard the story because she's a Black woman. Today's baggage: the erasure of violence against Black women. The 2020 uprisings have without a doubt made history. But what's glaring across social media and the mainstream news media is that the names of Black women who are killed by police violence are often erased and not invoked at all. It took Black women to uplift the name of Brianna Taylor, who was killed by Louisville Metro Police in March. But she's not the first Black woman who lost her life to state-sanctioned violence. Before Brianna, there was Shelly Frey, Michelle Cusseaux, Tanisha Anderson, Korryn Gaines, Atatiana Jefferson. This heartbreaking list goes on and on. You might have heard of them, or maybe not. Here's why. There's a long history of the erasure of Black women in conversations of state-sanctioned violence. Within an American context, this kind of violence towards Black women started during the days of slavery. After surviving the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Black people had an equally perilous fate. Slave owners were allowed to kill and maim enslaved Black people willy-nilly. Enslaved women were also raped by slave owners with no recourse because they were considered the property of their master. After emancipation, Black men, women, and children were terrorized and lynched. Welcome to the Jim Crow era. During this time, Black women were assaulted and raped with little protection of the law, and their lynchings also went overlooked. Kimberly Crenshaw is a law professor at UCLA and Columbia Law School and the executive director of the African American Policy Forum. She's well known for coining the term intersectionality as a way to describe how specific groups of people can experience multiple forms of oppression.
So right now we have these historical narratives about Black men. When Trayvon Martin was killed, people saw Emmett Till in that moment, and it was a galvanizing moment in Black history. It took us back to the beginning of the civil rights movement. But we don't have the equivalent when it comes to Black women. Nobody knows, for example, Recy Taylor, who was the Black woman who was raped, and Rosa Parks got her start as an activist defending her.
When it comes to Black women and state-sanctioned violence, Crenshaw has found that there's specific patterns in the ways that we're killed. We're seen as superhuman, specifically in mental health crises, like in the case of Michelle Cusseaux. And we're collateral damage, like in the cases of India Kager and Brianna Taylor. But what's starkly different about Taylor's case, though, is that this time, her name is being uplifted.
I think it's the happenstance that Brianna Taylor was killed within the season of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. I think that if Brianna Taylor had been killed in November, we probably would not be saying her name. In fact, we know it. Atatiana Jefferson was killed in the fall. There was a very brief moment in which there were sympathies expressed towards the family of this Black woman who was killed in her own home. And then just as quickly, it dissipated. The frame around police violence is largely a male-male frame. It is a frame that devolves from lynching. It's the idea of Black masculinity being constrained, being disciplined, being snuffed out. There is a realness to that. But that is not the exclusive way in which racial violence has been experienced, particularly anti-Black racial violence.
And what would you say to the sort of excuse that people give of, well, there's no footage?
So I'll remind people, we don't have any footage of Mike Brown, and yet that spurred the movement.
But Crenshaw reminds us that we do have footage of Natasha McKenna being killed. In 2015, McKenna died in Fairfax County Jail during a schizophrenic episode. She was tased 4 times by the police. Her last words were,
"You promised that you wouldn't kill me."
And then they proceed to kill her. There is no reason that I can think of why we're not marching and saying, you promised not to kill me, with every bit of righteous outrage and indignation that we say, I can't breathe.
I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
Not only do we see the erasure of Black women in social justice movements focusing on police violence, but gendered intra-racial violence, or violence within the race that both Black trans and cis women face, is also overlooked. Oluwatoyin Salau was a 19-year-old Black Lives Matter activist who was kidnapped, raped, and killed in June.
Look at my fucking hair, look at my skin, bruh. This shit, I can't take this shit off. So guess what? I'ma die about it.
She was on the front lines, passionately speaking out in the name of Black lives. But in her death, who is saying her name?
There is a deep asymmetry in our history and in our country around fighting anti-Black racism. There's an expectation that we show up, and we do show up for our brothers and sons and our fathers. But what about showing up for us? If Black women's loss of life or loss of sexual autonomy doesn't happen at the hands of non-Black people, we don't see it as a matter of racist inequality. It sort of cancels itself out, kind of like what happened with Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill.
While Salau wasn't killed by the racist police, Crenshaw says that we have to reflect on the conditions that made her life seem expendable. In 2014, Crenshaw created Say Her Name to honor Black women whose lives were taken by the police. Say Her Name is both a rallying cry on social media and at flesh and blood protests to bring attention to the Black women who are killed by state-sanctioned violence and to bring dignity to the families of those fallen women.
That measure of loss, that measure of, children crying for their mothers, mothers crying for their daughters, is no less than how daughters and parents of Black men feel. Yet one would think that it's less important when one recognizes that their names are not lifted up when we're marching and demanding justice. So for us, it was easy to correct that much, just saying, say her name.
We're now seeing people taking Say Her Name and saying say their names. I'm curious as to whether or not you think that essentially it's, the movement's being hijacked, for lack of a better term.
Well, I would say that hijacked is a term that more or less refers to intentional, taking of something. I think that a lot of people didn't know that Say Her Name was drawing attention to the thing that wasn't being said. Like when we were at the march in Eric Garner and some people came up to our poster and said, where are the men's names? And we were like, the men's names are on every other poster in this entire march. I think there are some folks who still believe that introducing the recognition that there are some who are left out is being divisive. But it's the same way that some people think Black Lives Matter is divisive, right? We have to say all lives matter. Well, we know all lives matter. The point is that we live in a society that acts as though some lives don't. That's why we say Black Lives Matter, and that's why we say Her Name. So the work that I do is to try to tell other stories about what oppression looks like, try to tell different narratives about what we can do differently, not to blame ourselves and our women and our daughters for the conditions that the society has created for us. I've talked about girls, I've talked about trans women, I've talked about disabled Black women. So when I say Black women in all our diversity, I mean all Black women. This is the demand of a fully inclusive racial justice campaign.
Why aren't Black girls and women seen as victims of racial abuse and protected? Why did it take the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd to collectively uplift the name of Brianna Taylor? And what about all the other Black women who were killed by the police? Will the news cover their stories? Or will their lives and legacies become a distant memory? So when we say Black Lives Matter, what Black lives are you talking about?